Life. Ain't it just a wonderful thing to have? Well, some not so much. But it's beautiful. It's filled with many species of animals, all living on their own, living for others, and some residing in safer habitats so they can continue on their lives. While other animals have to predate on others in order to survive. But not only that, but it's also filled with different plants, flowers that the bees love, poisonous flowers, and beauties of nature. But it's also filled with us, the human beings, who are also living, loving, and caring. But have you ever asked what's inside of all these living beings? What makes them up and how they're living? Well, this is Minecraft, so we can't really find out what's inside of all these living things. Why don't we take this to real life? There we go. Perfect. La di da. Totes malotes. There we go. Open the light. Let's go down. Let's open the door. Or that animal got cells too. But boom, zoom into the plant. Technically, it would require a microscope, but for dramatic, creative purposes, we just gotta go with the flow, you know? As we all know, inside of a plant are millions to trillions of cells, and inside these cells consist of organelles, each functioning on their own roles to create and deliver nutrients and killing bacteria to keep everything living alive. But first, pause. How did we get here? How did we know that there are organelles inside cells? Now actually scratch that. How did we find out that cells even existed? So let's take a deep rewind on how cells were found, the tools that were used, the theories conducted, and the scientists and philosophers that carved the way to where we are now. The cell theory. Let's start from the beginning. The cells is what we can say the building blocks of life. And according to the cell theory, the cell is the basic unit of life. All living things are made of cells, and that cells come from pre-existing cells. It all started when Zacharias Janssen invented the first compound microscope. With the help of his father, he placed several lenses together in which he discovered that objects enlarge when viewed. In 1665, Robert Hooke examined a thin slice of cork under a microscope he made, and during that experiment, he found that there were small compartments in the cork. This experiment led him to the discovery of the cells, or cellula at that time. The cellular term came from a reminder of the little rooms in the monastery. He later reported this discovery to the publication Micrographia, which would pave the way for the term cells.
A few years later, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek would create a microscope with a higher magnification than Hooke's. With this microscope, he observed specimens like bacteria, blood cells, and protists, which he called animalcules. With this microscope, he also discovered the egg and sperm cells and the process of fertilization, which disproved the spontaneous generation, which we will discuss later.
But it only took just a couple hundred years, not a lot in my book, really, until improvements were made to the microscope, which led to even more discoveries. Such improvements and discoveries were utilized and found by Professors Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann. Schleiden conducted research on plants under a microscope, which gave him the conclusion that all organisms are made out of cells and that cells are the basic unit of life. In comparison, Schwann concluded that all animals came from cells as well.
However, it wasn't Schwann who proved the last postulate of the cell theory, but it was Rudolf Virchow in 1858. He studied that cells play a role in body diseases, which gave him the conclusion that cells come from pre-existing cells, with the words omnicellula acellula, meaning cells arise from a pre-existing cell.
Like in present times, we truly live in a society, Joker moment, where people cannot just believe in one thing. And there comes a division, or what you can say, maybe a division is the word, with what theory people will believe in. Enter the theory of spontaneous generation, which was greatly disproved by the cell theory.
I'm stronger, I'm smarter, I'm better, I am better!
Well, besides by that meme or clip right there from The Voice, which you totally should watch, spontaneous generation is the theory that believes animals come from non-living sources. For example, frogs being formed out of rain, mice from sweaty underwear. Ew, bro, how do you make your underwear sweaty? And flies arising from decaying meat.
This process is also called abiogenesis. This theory was followed by many because it was what was told by many authorities during that time.
But it wasn't until 1668 that one Francisco Ready was ready, no pun intended there really, trust me bro, trust me, and attempted to disprove this theory. In his experiment, he prepared 3 jars. One jar contained fresh meat with the lid left open. The second was covered with a gauge with fresh meat inside, and the third also had fresh meat inside it, but instead there was a cloth on top of the jar. You know, just a picture right there. Just look at it, bro. Just look at it, man. In his experiment, the first jar had maggots crawling in the meat. The second jar had none, while the third jar had maggots on the cloth, not in the meat, but on the cloth. But just like in present times, there's always gotta be haters, you know, we can't really have good things all the time. In Reddy's experiment, he had critics as well. According to these critics, he didn't really prove anything, there were too many variables, yada yada yada. So, in his redemption arc, he reconducted a similar experiment, wherein mesh would fly on the jars instead of flies. The same occurred where eggs grew on top of the cloth. With this experiment, he conducted that all living beings come from the seeds of plants or animals. However, in 1745, John Needham made a test to check the validity of spontaneous generation. He believed that boiling kills microorganisms, so he experimented with boiling chicken broth and then sealing it after boiling. In this experiment, microbes appeared after a few days, proving that the source of life is the broth. But Lazzaro Spallanzani pulled out a reverse Uno card move and was not convinced by this and decided to experiment similarly. But this time, one flask was left open and the other was sealed. With the similar experiment, microorganisms appeared in the unsealed flask while the other had none. This disproved Needham's experiment. However, one scientist named Louis Pasteur squashed the idea of spontaneous generation with passion. In his experiment, he used a swan neck flask where the air was allowed to enter, but microbes were unable. After days, no growth happened until he tipped the flask wherein the broth would contact the dust, resulting in growth. This means that the broth cannot make life independently, even with air. It must make contact with the microbes, eliminating the possibility of spontaneous generation. Who is on Discord right now, bro? With the theory of generation out of the equation, this leaves the cell as the main concept of life for every living organism.